right, we're back, and let's talk in this lesson about what we want to include in the Code of Conduct policies. And this is not an exhaustive list, but if you got all of these things into your policy and they were right for your organization, you'd have a pretty good, darn good Code of Conduct. So one of the things that we often include in conduct is those three fiduciary duties. So the duty of diligence or care, the duty of loyalty, and the duty of obedience. And give a short little synopsis. Don't just put duty of care, duty of loyalty, duty of obedience. Make sure you just give, one sentence or two sentences under each of those so that board members are reminded, if they haven't read it elsewhere, if they haven't followed the Great Boards video course, they will know what they're supposed to do under each one of those things. So a little bit of description is a good idea here. The second thing you want to consider is requiring board members to support the organization's vision, mission, values, goals, whatever other foundational documents, to abide by the bylaws if you want to put it in there. But again, don't give a whole lot of detail around that. One of the things that I like to then add is a few kind of key points. First of all is adequate preparation, attendance, and participation at board and committee meetings. The whole idea of disengaged boards has become a very trendy and hot button kind of issue. And part of the reason that I think we're disengaged is executive directors are very often doing a lot of what the board is required to do. If we step that up, raise the bar a little bit, and then say to our board members, you must prepare. And I shared with you in an earlier module, having watched one of my own board members when I was an executive director, reading the stuff that we had sent him, and he was reading it in the car like 10 minutes before the board meeting was to start. That's not preparation. And because I happened to walk by his car, I was getting out of my own car, I happened to walk by his car and watched him reading the stuff in his board package. He came in looking a little bit sheepish. And I just kind of laughed and I said, fast reader, right, Ian? And he was a really bad, kind of fast guy for doing things quickly anyway. And he was also a really hard-working manager in a healthcare system that he had a pretty big workload. So, cut everybody some slack at certain points in time. He was not a disengaged board member, but we can't speak well or ask good questions about things that are on an agenda if we haven't adequately prepared. And let me tell you, board members who are listening to this, executive directors, management staff, and your administrative clerical staff, they spend a lot of time putting that package together. There's thought that goes into it. What does the board need? How much should we send them? Is this too much? Is it too little? And sometimes we're actually photocopying paper copies. Increasingly, this is all sent electronically. But electronic doesn't necessarily mean we're going to increase the probability of reading it. If you're like me, when I get an attachment to an email, I often download the attachment right away with the intention of going back to it immediately. And that's that's the default intention, but the problem is that we very often don't get back to it. It's like receiving it in the mail. You get your envelope, it's a half-inch thick package, and it sits on your desk or your kitchen table, and it waits, and it's unopened. And so what we really want to do is to understand that when there's preparation, time, and energy going into this, we have an obligation to make sure that we read the whole package and that we're ready for our meetings and we're ready to speak to issues and ask good questions. We need to participate in events. The executive directors will give you a litany of stories over a number of years where boards committed to doing a special event, a fundraiser, a barbecue, a staff recognition luncheon, and it doesn't happen unless the senior management of the organization or a team, a committee of internal staff makes it happen. So don't commit to it if you don't want to do it. It's better to send a heartfelt note and a card and a gift certificate with it if you're doing a recognition thing. If it's a fundraising event, it is the board's job to ensure the organization is adequately resourced. So boards being hands-off with organizing events, every board member should have a role to play in major events and key board members in smaller events, and everybody should be showing up. Years ago, when we started a new program in the agency that I was the ED of, we had a grand opening of one of our new services. And as we were ready, the minister was there, there from our provincial funder, and as we were ready to cut the ribbon, literally there was a ribbon and there was big scissors. There was a lot of planning that had gone into it. There was a fair amount of agency money on the table paying for, refreshments. And I looked around the room, there wasn't a single board member there. And it was a real moment of disappointment for me, but it was also a moment of knowing that I had work to do with my board. Just remind yourself, executive directors, when you're watching this, you have a job to do to support your board to help it get to the point where it is engaged. So that whole idea of participation is really critical. If you haven't participated in organizing, fine. We don't need the whole board to organize, but you should show up. You should buy your tickets. You should be present, and that's part of being on a board and being a board volunteer. And the third thing on this list that is really important is to speak positively about the organization. You should know your organization. Here's the elevator speech, or the speech that you're going to give at a cocktail party when someone says, "What do you do for a living?" The next question is, do you do volunteering in your community? And you can say, "Yeah, I'm on the East Overshoe Society board." And there's such an incredible organization. Like, this is what we do, and this is who we hire, and this is who we serve, and this is our budget, and this is how much we give back to the community, and this is how we respond to community need. You should have that speech in your head, right? And if you're a brand new board member, you're to be excused, but get ready to be able to answer those kinds of questions. There should be enthusiasm in your voice and in your demeanor, because you are a public relations emissary of that organization in your volunteer role. When staff speak positively about the organization, it's a bit self-serving. That's where they're employed. That's who pays their paycheck. But when board members speak passionately about the organization, I'm always heads up on that and saying this place must be special, and this board member must be special, because they're really engaged, they're really keen, and they're really knowledgeable about the organization. Making sure that we are in the next point in the content of your code of conduct is that we treat each other and board members, volunteers, participants with respect. You can define respect if you want, but there are common definitions of respect, and I think most of us have a pretty clear understanding of what respectful and disrespectful behavior look like. A next thing that needs to be in your code of conduct is an expectation regarding maintaining open, honest, and direct communication. This says we're going to talk openly, face-to-face, emails, text messages, whatever. We're going to be honest, we're going to be direct, and we're going to make sure that we have these things working well for us, and that we are working on behalf of the organization to further the organization by maintaining that kind of open communication. Next thing on our list is a statement regarding direction by the board to employees. This is a really important one because it's one that we run amok of fairly often. So I've given you a draft one here. By all means, lift it and modify it so it's part of your organization. Take it and look at what you already have, compare it, and maybe tweak what you already have based on this. So I'll just read it to you. The board has one employee, the executive director, who takes direction from the board as a whole. That clarifies no individual board member may give direction. Individual members of the board may not give direction or offer critical feedback to any employee, including the executive director, unless specifically requested to do so by motion of the board. So in other words, if there's feedback to be given, a motion of the board will direct a board member, usually the chairperson of the board, to give that feedback. It might be done via a board motion in response to performance appraisal, whatever that might be. It's clear here then how we must interact with employees. Now, what I like about this policy is that it doesn't then say to us the board must not have no contact with employees. It simply prescribes the boundaries of that contact so that it stays healthy, so that we don't have board members bumping into a staff member at the grocery store who, bitches, moans and whines about something. It's operational inside the organization, and the board member feeds it like crazy and then thinks we have a big problem, and then it doesn't get to the executive director, and then all of a sudden we have something going on at the board level, and then we have executive directors that are wondering what on earth is going on, is somebody unhappy? and we're jousting at windmills. We don't know what the problem is and we can't tackle it. Remind yourself as board members that executive directors don't know everything about their organization, and they can't fix what they don't know about. So it's absolutely critical when a staff member approaches a board member that they be redirected by that board member to say, you know what, I know I'm on the board and I kind of feel like I'm one of the bosses of the organization, but I cannot hear this complaint. You must take it to your supervisor, manager, or executive director inside the organization. And if you've already done that and it hasn't been resolved in a week or two, you can in fact bring a grievance formally in writing to the board, and the board will review that. But right now, right here in this lineup in the grocery store, this is an off topic and an out of boundaries conversation. I'm really sorry, I can't have it with you. Now that takes some courage from a board member's perspective, but mostly it takes clarity by the board member in saying, I know my job here, and my job is not to listen to this. This is an operational issue, and I'm not going to watch an employee do an end run and leave me in a really difficult position and leave them with an expectation that I'm going to do something to fix this problem. So really an important part of clarity under your code of conduct. All right, continuing on then, adhering to bylaws and governance policies, we've touched on that. Timely identification of conflicts of interest. So this is a code of conduct policy that says we're going to have a conflict of interest policy, and you must in a timely way identify when you yourself are potentially in conflict or when others on the board or senior management are in conflict. So your conflict of interest policy, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, is going to in fact give you prescriptive rules on that, but your code of conduct policy tells you refer to the conflict of interest policy on this. We want to have a policy within code of conduct that talks about dealing transparency on all matters, bringing forward factual and truthful information to assist the board with problem solving, decision making on any issue that might come forward. So speculation and assumption doesn't have a lot of traction here. What we really want to do is to say, here are some factual information, or suggestion that we go get some factual information, right? So what we want here is something in the policy that says we're not dealing with suppositions and assumptions and opinions and perceptions. We're dealing with facts, and we're going to bring that information transparently forward. If it's bad news or if it's good news, we're going to make it as factual as we possibly can. So you would never say something, for example, like, I'm hearing rumors that, or the rumbling on the street is that, or I'm wondering if this is true. That's all presumption, assumption, third hand, fourth hand, non-specific. If someone comes up to you and says, I'm really worried about, because the meeting that I was in last week, this is what was said, then you have some factual information that you can track back. You don't take that just at face value. You're certainly going to want to do some investigation or review or information gathering. But when people come forward with something that's a little more tangible, a lot firmer, then it's worth review. So Code of Conduct says that we don't deal in supposition, assumptions, presumptions, any of those kinds of things. We want to make sure that there's a policy within the Code of Conduct that says something about not engaging in secretive behaviors that could do damage to reputation, damage morale, either of the board or the staff, or create conflict within or outside the organization. I can tell you that my inbox pretty much every month has 2 or 3 inquiries from either board members or from staff members by email saying, this is what's happening with our board and what do we do about it. And part of the what we're going to do about it is upstream of that, we're going to create policies that are very clear and that people have signed off, and that says we don't engage in secretive behavior that could do damage. It's not the way we do business, and because of the one that just was right before this is that we're transparent and we don't sweep our issues and challenges and problems under the rug. We talk about them, but we also don't do it in a way that is going to do damage or is ultimately going to hurt people. Now, where does the confidentiality piece of board work come in? It comes into the the code of conduct. I have no issue with where you put it. You can have your confidentiality as a separate policy, but it's still part of how we behave. So when you think about conduct being behavior, it can sit very nicely in the code of conduct as well. Either way, as long as it's there, it really doesn't matter. So I've given you some wording here in about 4 or 5 different points. The first one is directors must hold all information about the organization confidential unless permission is given to release the information or unless the information is public knowledge. So if a donor has announced that they have made a major donation to your organization, it's public knowledge. Your board members and senior staff can talk about it. However, if the donor has not released that information and it's a major gift, then the board says nothing about it, even if they're aware that you just got $20,000 from this particular organization or individual. Second one is if a director is uncertain about whether information may be discussed, she or he must seek the direction of the chairperson or executive director. So the question is this shareable or is it not shareable? Am I supposed to keep this under wraps or not? So if you're not sure, either in a meeting or outside a meeting via text or an email, make sure you get clarity on that before you start flapping your lips and talking about this. You don't want to burn anybody at any point in time because that is damaging to relationships. Third one is directors will refrain from commenting on any issue related to organization unless permitted or directed by a motion of the board. So we saw this one not that long ago in my home city in Alberta, Canada, and we had a meltdown in part of our regional health authority. The CEO was not on good terms with the board. There was some conflict that was happening inside. The news media were standing literally with cameras and microphones outside of board meetings, and when the doors opened and people came out, there was clearly no plan to communicate. And so as a result, one of the board members just came through the door first or second, and the media grabbed them and the board member stopped, and the board member started talking about what happened in the board meeting, which was completely inappropriate. And it was a lesson learned. Very quickly there was a redirection and a very quick appointment of a media spokesperson who was then well prepared to come out the door and have a conversation with the media. The media got to answer the questions, but that person was skilled and adept in media management and was able to answer questions in a way that kind of didn't sell the farm or let the cat out of the bag or any of those other euphemisms that we might want to use. We want to then make sure that if we have issues identified that are conduct-based, that we have a way of resolving them. So look at a couple of statements that you might consider here. And by the way, if you want to lift these, that's fine. I'm entirely fine with that. But I would counsel you to make sure you look at them for fit, adjust your language, make them shorter, do whatever you can to improve on what's here. They're simply samples. They're simply examples to give you an idea of what you might do. All right, directors will bring concerns regarding the conduct of members directly to the chairperson as soon as an issue arises. This is an important point. The chairperson is the moderator of board behavior. So this is not something that the executive director should be apprised of or should have to deal with. It's not something that another board member should have to deal with a colleague. The arbiter of board behavior and compliance with the code of conduct is in fact the chairperson of the board. And in the chairperson's job description, you always need at least 1 or 2 points that clarify that this is the job of the chairperson. It's not ever your happiest moment if you're chairing a board, if this kind of thing happens, but fortunately it doesn't happen all that often. Second part of this is if an issue relates to the chairperson, then the member may identify his or her concerns with any member of the board executive. That often will be the vice chairperson, so it depends on the dynamics in the board, but very definitely if it's a chairperson issue, it's got to be taken to the member of the executive. It's very common, folks, for executive directors to know there's a problem because they live and breathe board work inside the organization, but it's not the executive director's job to talk with anybody about it or to seek resolution. It's a internal board matter, and it needs to be resolved by the board. Second point here is that, or the second policy is that no time will directors approach other members of the board, staff members, association members, or the public to discuss issues, concerns without permission or direction via board motion. So this means that you take stuff seriously and you deal with it inside the organization to seek resolution. The next one is, at the request of the board, the chairperson will meet face-to-face to discuss concerns about members' conduct. The constructive resolution will be identified, and this information will be shared with the board at a future board meeting. Now, you'll be surprised at how many issues are just ones of clarity. And, the chairperson just says, you know what? When you came out of that meeting, you shouldn't have spoken to the media, because that's not kind of every board member's role. And, then I would probably, if I was in that circumstance, say, you know what, we didn't do a very good job of appointing a spokesperson, and we weren't ready for the scrum of media that were outside our door, so we could have done a better job of that. But just in the future, just be conscious that no one should be speaking to the media except the person that the board appoints to do that, and the board needs to do a better job of that going forward. So that's a good way of handling it. 90% of your members will just simply say, oops, sorry, I didn't know that, or and I was in the middle of it, I knew that I shouldn't have been doing this. So self-reflection is usually pretty instantaneous, and put the issue to bed, right? No damage to relationship, just a quick conversation between two board members, and the issue can be dealt with in a polite, respectful, professional kind of manner. And then another policy, at its sole discretion, the board may, by a majority vote, remove any member whose conduct does not comply with any governance policy. The board must not violate any protected human rights when removing a member from the board. So this says whatever your human rights code is of your jurisdiction, you must make sure that this is not a discriminatory dismissal from the board. But this is very clear that the board, not the members, the board can remove another member. Now, your bylaws will probably say something about removal of members, so make sure that your policy and your bylaws are congruent. If your bylaws are either mute on this, or they're kind of clunky on this, my recommendation would be to you to make sure that you put something else in place for your board that is more current, and then fix your bylaws. So let your governance policies sit with good policy, because you have control of those, and then do a bylaw review and change the bylaws so that the two of them match up. The next point in your conduct policy is that directing members how to manage staff or individual clients and concerns that are brought forward by an individual member. So here's the policy that I was referring to a little bit earlier. If anyone brings forward a concern to the board member, the director will redirect the person to appropriate senior manager or the executive director. So if you're not sure where it's supposed to go, just say, I'm not sure who you should talk to, but talk to the executive director. Right? The next step is the board member will also immediately contact the executive director to inform her or him of the issue and how it was managed by the board member. So this builds relationship, and that partnership, that hand-in-glove relationship between executive directors and board members, this builds relationship between the two, because it says to the executive director, I had a board member who was in a tough situation, they were uncomfortable, but they knew their role and they managed this well. I'm going to tell you, you'll make your executive director's day. And if you don't manage it well, you can still call the executive director and say, I think I messed this up, or I could have done this better, but I want you to know. So you don't have to be perfect, and all of us say and do things in the moment that perhaps when in reflection that isn't exactly what we wished we'd done. Still make the call, and I would encourage this to be a call or a face-to-face. Emails lose things in translation when it comes to difficult kinds of communication. So that's an important piece. And then the final part of this, if the issue relates to the behavior of the executive director, then the board member will notify the chairperson and the chairperson will determine how best to address the concern. So whether that's to talk to the executive about it, or perhaps the chairperson will talk directly to the executive director if it's not too serious, significant an issue. So that's kind of the meat and potatoes. That's the core of what needs to go into a code of conduct. Again, I'll remind you, this is not an exhaustive list, and if you look at code of conduct from other organizations, you might find a few things that you really like, what other nonprofits are doing in their codes of conduct, that you can just get their permission to use when you build your code of conduct. I would encourage you to go back through your code of conduct if you have one and see if it includes all of these key points. That's the end of this lesson, and I hope you'll continue on to the next lesson in this module.